the Southern Ohio Farm Show. This is Gigi Neal of OSU Extension in Claremont County, Agricultural and Natural Resources Educator.
I'm James Morris, the Agricultural and Natural Resources and Community Development Educator for the Ohio State University Extension in Brown County.
And I'm Brooke Beam, the Ohio State University Extension Educator for Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Community Development in Highland County. And we will be your hosts for the Southern Ohio Farm Show. Throughout the month of November, every episode of the Southern Ohio Farm Show will feature a new recipe or technique to include in your Thanksgiving meal this year. Our first recipe is my mother's favorite recipe that she makes for every holiday, and it's called the Thanksgiving Salad. It's from the President's own White House cookbook, and it was published in 1968. This recipe, it can be either as a side dish or as a dessert, as it is very sweet. So follow along with the recipe and you can make this for your family this year.
Hi, I'm James Morris and I'm the Extension Educator for the Ohio State University Extension in Brown County. And today we're going to be discussing issues related to drought-stressed forages and how we can manage those. And today we're here in southern Brown County in a field of sorghum sudan grass, as you can tell, has just been cut. And this year, of course, threw us a couple curveballs. As we well know, we've been used to the last few years of excessive rainfall during the summers, and this year we had quite the opposite, as 2020 has been opposite for most of everything else. We were extremely dry.
So as you can see here, according to the U.S. Drought Monitor, much of Ohio was in at least a abnormally dry to a moderate drought condition, and as I have highlighted down at the bottom, the southern portion of Brown County was in a D1 drought condition, which is moderate drought, and then most of the rest of southern Ohio was at least abnormally dry during that time.
So of course that's a very critical period for a lot of our forages, not only in terms of negative impacts on the quantity that you were going to have, but also on quality. So we're going to talk about a couple of those quality factors that we may have issues with and want to make sure that we pay attention to throughout the season and how we can manage those. So the first issue that we're going to talk about is nitrate accumulation, which is the main issue that we have at this field and why we really wanted to pay attention to it. So as I mentioned, this field was cut on July 28th. It was planted in sorghum Sudan grass in early June. I believe the second week of June is when this was planted. And the producer noticed just a few weeks before he was ready for harvest that there was some yellowing on the leaves. And on top of that, we had kind of the perfect storm come in. We had a good bit of rainfall break that drought spell just a week before the 28th. So for that reason, we had a little bit of concerns with nitrate accumulation. And just to kind of give you some background on why we have this concern is because plants take up nitrate from the soil. They then convert that to nitrite and then to ammonia, and then they finally convert that into amino acids and plant protein. But if we have drought-like conditions or even frost conditions that slow down that process, that metabolism, and slow down photosynthesis, then we are accumulating all of that nitrate towards the bottom 1/3 of that plant. And then when we finally get that rainfall that comes through that ends that drought period, we have a flush uptake and a rapid uptake of all of those nitrates. So we were a little concerned about that, but we have to keep in mind that nitrate accumulation along with prussic acid, which we're going to talk about here in just a minute, they are more concentrated in younger, smaller plants. So the big benefit here we had in this field
is that we had plenty of plant growth, and as you can tell here in this picture, that's Richard Purton, our Adams County educator, standing next to the edge of the field. And this field was probably about 5 to 6 foot tall at the time of harvest, so that really helped reduce the risk of really toxic levels of concentration.
But anytime you have any concerns, you need to do exactly what this producer did and test that forage before you ever feed it. Now, as we talk about nitrates, the dry hay making process will not take any considerable amount of the nitrates out of those plants. So the dry hay making process will not have an effect on it, but the ensiling or silage process, or the haylage process I should say, will reduce nitrate levels in the forages anywhere between 10 to 60%. Now, that 10 to 60%, that's a wide range. That's because it all depends on how well you get it wrapped or packed, and that way that fermentation process is good. So if we have a good fermentation process, we can have a big reduction in the amount of nitrates in that forage. So again, we still want to test to make sure, but the ensiling or haylage process will reduce levels where the dry hay making process will not. But even if you are going to be putting it in a bunker or a silo, they may escape as nitrous oxide, which is a gas. So before you jump in and start removing that silage, you want to make sure you remove that tarp or that cover at least 1 to 2 days before, so those nitrous oxide gases can escape. That way they're not toxic to you and your livestock. Now, as we talk about this being a concern for livestock, it's really a concern especially for our hogs. They're probably the most sensitive to it, followed by our cattle and sheep, and the least sensitive being our horses. And as far as plants that we have to worry about accumulating nitrates, one that we commonly think of is our millet. So pearl millet, foxtail millet, of course our sorghum Sudan varieties, Sudan grasses, sorghum, forage sorghum, and even corn. It takes up a lot of nitrogen, so it can also have some high nitrate accumulation as well. Now we'll talk about how we managed it in this field in just a minute, but now we're going to move on to prussic acid. Now we talked about the classes of livestock and their sensitivity levels, but of course an older, less healthy animal is going to be much more sensitive than a younger, healthy animal. And a fetus of a pregnant animal is also very, very sensitive to nitrate levels as well. Now prussic acid is another issue that we have to be concerned with when we have drought-like conditions or any conditions such as frost that slow that plant growth. And just like nitrates, it's going to be more concentrated in those younger, smaller plants. And unlike nitrates though, the dry hay making process will reduce some of the prussic acid levels, whereas the haylage and ensiling process will not. And with prussic acid, also called cyanide, our ruminants are much more sensitive than our horses and pigs in this case, because actually the cud chewing and the rumen bacterial activity actually help release that cyanide from the plant material. The species we have to be the most concerned about with prussic acid accumulation is our grain sorghums, our forage sorghum and Sudan grasses, and then Indian grass as well. Now Sudan grass is probably more of a moderate concern, where our sorghums are a little bit higher on there along with our Indian grass. Now our millets, our pearl millet and foxtail millet, are the least likely to be causing issues for prussic acid concerns. So now as we move on to the management portion, of course we can't control what Mother Nature gives us, but how can we help reduce the risk in field before we make that hay and feed it to our livestock? So I'm just going to run through some examples of what this producer did here, this farm in southern Brown County, because they did a great job. We helped them along the way. So just to give a great example, we just to recap, this field again was planted early June and was prepared to be harvested July 28th. And we did receive a drought-ending rain coming into the harvest time. And of course, we also had yellowing on the leaves. So we had a lot of conditions to be concerned with. So we had to take a look back at the beginning of the season. We have to be careful on how much nitrogen was applied early in the season. Now this producer only applied 300 pounds of triple 19. So in this case, they only applied about 57 pounds of nitrogen to the acre. And really, that's not a level to be concerned with. And in fact, a fact sheet from the University of Kentucky for sorghum Sudan grass recommends anywhere between 60 to 80 for planting and establishing sorghum Sudan grass. Now that we know that we didn't have extremely high levels of nitrogen or manure applied to this field early in the season, that also helps us give a little bit of comfort level as to what those nitrate accumulations potential was. Now, also, we mentioned the rain came in, so we recommend giving at least 5 to 7 days after a rain to allow for new plant growth, but also for those nitrates to dilute throughout the plant, especially for nitrates. Now, if we're talking about prussic acid, we recommend around at least 2 to 3 weeks to allow for new plant growth to grow onto those plants to reduce the concentrations of the prussic acid. Now, as we talk about a couple weeks to allow for plant growth, the same can be said for if you have a very small forage. Now, in this case, we were 5 to 6 foot tall at the time of harvest, so not much of a concern there. We mentioned that these nitrates and prussic acids can accumulate in younger, smaller plants, so we recommend those plants to be at least 2 foot tall or higher at the time of harvest if you believe there's going to be issues with prussic acid or nitrate accumulation. And finally, as we jump back to what we mentioned earlier, that the nitrate accumulates towards the bottom third of the plant. So it may be beneficial to raise your cutting height about 2 to 4 inches to get out of those areas of high concentration and avoid adding those to your forage. And one more last fun fact about the nitrates is that the concentration is actually higher in the morning than it is in the afternoon. That's because we talked about that process of breaking those nitrates down to plant proteins and amino acids, and as they start from the morning into the afternoon, they have more time to do that, so your nitrate concentrations ends up being lower. The last and final step is after we've done all those steps, we talked about making sure we had our fertilizer in check from the beginning to make sure we know how much we applied, allowing the plants to grow, giving it time after a rainfall, and raising the cutting bar height. Once we get that done out of the field, when we come back on, if we still, in this case, we didn't know what the weather was going to provide for us. So we didn't know if it was going to continue to be dry, and we didn't want to run into issues if it did. So we played it safe and only applied the producer only applied about 100 pounds of urea. So we stayed about the 50 unit mark again for the post-harvest application for the second cutting. And by about 40 days of growth after the first cutting, the second cutting was ready and cut on September 8th, a little later than they wanted, but we had to play around some rain.
And as you can see here, it was already up about 6 foot tall just after 40 days as we were getting ready for the second cutting.
They say good fences make good neighbors. We can also say that good buffers make for a healthy watershed. Buffer strips, or filter strips, are an important tool the agricultural industry can use to protect water resources by reducing the amount of nutrients and sediment we lose off our land. Soil is extremely valuable, and we spend a lot of money on nutrient application. The last thing we want is for soil and nutrients to wash downstream, impacting drinking water and water resources our communities rely on. Understanding where and how to use buffer strips will greatly reduce our nutrient and sediment loss from our landscape. Buffer strips are areas of permanent vegetation bordering a river, ditch, sinkhole, or tile inlet, or any other environmentally sensitive area. The buffer is efficient at intercepting and filtering out soil particles, which have phosphorus or other nutrients attached. Buffers can be used to square up fields and eliminate unprofitable areas. Research shows edges of fields can produce lower yields and can be unprofitable because of drainage issues, wildlife damage, soil compaction, and other issues. These areas can make more sense to be used as a buffer. Private landowners can play a major role in improving the overall health of their watershed. Buffer strips are a tried and true method. Buffer strips are an essential tool for a successful farming operation. Don't let your customers' valuable nutrients run off the field. Discuss implementing buffer strips with your customers today. To learn more about buffer strips and other best management practices, visit agbmps.osu.edu.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Vinton Furnace State Forest. Today I'd like to introduce you to big-tooth aspen. Big-tooth aspen is Populus grandidentata. Populus is the genus which includes the cottonwoods and the aspens, and grandidentata translates to big teeth. It's a relatively short-lived species. It's what we call an early successional species, in that it has very light seeds that are windblown and can travel great distances. And if they find a bare piece of ground and get plenty of light, they can grow very fast, very tall, but they don't live very long. Big-tooth aspen is also clonal, so it's not uncommon that several large stems share a root system. And if you look around me, several of the stems, or most of the stems in this general area, are also big-tooth aspen. Its cousin, the quaking aspen, is known because it has some of the largest individual living organisms on Earth, because whole mountainsides happen to share common root systems. But like its cousin, the quaking aspen, the big-tooth aspen has a flattened petiole. So the stalk on a leaf is called a petiole, and when you look at the stalk of an aspen or a populus, they tend to be flat. So think of a noodle instead of spaghetti. You can't roll them easily between your fingers. You have to really work at it. But if I take this red maple leaf, it rolls very easily. Or if I take a leaf of a white oak, the petiole rolls between my fingers. But the aspen petioles are flattened, so they don't roll very easily. They have edges, they're very flat. And because that petiole is very flat, they're very flimsy. And the quaking aspen and the big-tooth aspen, and even the cottonwood to some extent, will blow or move around with almost no wind. So if you get just a very slight wind, or even just heat rising on a very hot summer day, you'll see the leaves move and tremble or shake. The other thing that distinguishes this from the other aspens and the cottonwood, it's more of a rounded leaf but very large teeth. The cottonwood would be more triangular, have a very flat base, and then the quaking aspen has very fine teeth. Big-tooth aspen is probably more common in the southern part of the state, where quaking aspen is probably a little bit more common in the northern part of the state. The range maps show quaking aspen down here in southern Ohio, but I rarely see them, if ever, see them down here in the southern part of the state. Fairly long petiole, can be almost 3 inches in length, and again it's flattened. The leaf blade is more rounded. It says up to 5 inches in length, but I rarely see them much more than 3. In fact, 3 is probably a good average. They tend to turn bright yellow in the fall, and the crowns can be glorious and bright yellow. There's a few aspens out here that are hanging on to their leaves, but most of them have hit the ground by now. If you look at the twigs, nothing really exciting about them. Especially the terminal bud seems to be a little bit silvery, especially the scales towards the base, or a little bit hairy. And then the tip may have a reddish color, reddish brown twig. That's a pretty decent ID characteristic. If you look at the eastern cottonwood, they'll have a much longer, kind of a sticky resinous bud, where these are short, somewhat silvery, hairy. And then the bark is deep furrowed on a large tree like this, and as on a smaller tree, you'll often pick up a diamond pattern in the bark, and I'll show you on a smaller stem what that looks like. But you'll tend to have these little diamonds that'll split and they're not as apparent on this larger tree. And then as we look up into the crown of these aspens, they tend to self-prove fairly well. They tend to be light, kind of a tannish or even a whitish color up high, and some people confuse these with birch. But again, this is big-tooth aspen, a relatively short-lived tree that we see fairly commonly, especially in areas that have been disturbed in the past. Again, thank you, and please take part of your day to spend it in the woods.